Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
And I'm Krista Carmen.
and this is
Murder Coaster.
Pee Wee Gaskins, an infamous name in the annals of true crime. He was called the meanest man in America, the redneck Charles Manson. He drove a hearse and had his own graveyard where he'd dispose of victims he'd poisoned, shot, stabbed, strangled, drowned, bludgeoned, even using explosives to blow a man's head off in the most unlikely of places. He killed men, he killed women, he even killed children, including a 2-year-old infant. And at the end of his life, he'd claimed to be a sex-crazed serial killer and confessed to over 100 murders, though most of them are believed to be fabricated. But there can be no denying those buried on his very land, as well as those he'd later lead police to. Yes, there is no doubt that Pee Wee Gaskins was a stone-cold killer, and that a minimum of 15 people met their ends through his hands. But he was a self-confessed liar and master manipulator, and like most psychopaths, used a litany of masks to hide his true nature, making it quite difficult to differentiate fact from fiction and ever understand who the true Pee Wee Gaskins was. And so, today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take an interesting approach and view him from the eyes of two writers who were hired to write his life story, and the two very, very different versions of his life and crimes that each of them were given. Today, we present to you part one of the Pee Wee Gaskins story, Pee Wee and Mr. Jim.
Let's begin. Prologue. Rudolph is a dead man. In September of 1982, it seemed like everyone wanted Rudolph Tyner dead. The state of South Carolina had sentenced him to death after being found guilty of killing Myrtle and Bill Moon during a botched robbery. And now he was just waiting on death row at Columbia's Central Correctional Institution in South Carolina for his appointment with the electric chair. But the execution wasn't happening fast enough for Tony Simo. Myrtle was Tony's mother, and Tony wanted Rudolph dead now. Tony Simo's friends also wanted Rudolph Tyner dead. And a prisoner named Pee Wee Gaskins wanted him dead as well. To Pee Wee, Rudolph had broken the code. He was a black man who'd killed a white couple.
Pee Wee Gaskins was a racist, which was no surprise. He came from the Jim Crow South, a racist place at a very racist time. For instance, despite Supreme Court rulings, South Carolina schools were able to remain segregated until 1970. And to this day, there are still private schools in the state, which are strictly white-only institutions. So when Tony Simo offered Pee Wee Gaskins $200 to kill Rudolph Tyner, the same amount Tyner had taken during the robbery, Pee Wee gladly accepted. And it was just a matter of time before Rudolph met his end. For Pee Wee Gaskins was a master in the art of murder.
Pee Wee Gaskins was a convicted murderer, infamous for having killed more people in South Carolina than any other, at least 14. He'd been given the death penalty, but narrowly missed his appointment with the electric chair. his sentence being commuted to life in prison when the South Carolina General Assembly's 1974 ruling on capital punishment was changed to conform to the U.S. Supreme Court's new guidelines, which stated that death penalty cases must have a separate sentencing phase.
Pee Wee was a bit of a celebrity, his exploits making him infamous. He was famous for the ruthlessness that juxtaposed his tiny stature and strange, high-pitched and squeaky voice. He'd grown up in institutions, and though he was quite small in size, he learned how to dominate through ruthlessness and intelligence, rising up the criminal ranks to be what he called a power man.
He'd escaped from jails, prisons, and reformatories many times, once pretending to have drowned in quicksand. When he was finally apprehended that time, a guard told him that they had dug in that quicksand for a week looking for him, to which Pee Wee said,
"Well, did they ever find me?"
"No."
Why not?"
"Because you're smarter than them, Pee Wee."
On the outside, he had his own criminal enterprise, a massive car theft ring, often traveling with the carnival to keep moving and stay in the shadows. He was famed as an outlaw, could manipulate a lie detector test perfectly. He'd become so famous that there was even a college professor writing a book on him that would often visit him there in the prison.
In prison, Pee Wee had the highest of status, and he was given free rein. He'd been in state institutions his whole life and knew them inside and out, and his life sentence was deemed a sign of stability to prison officials, as he obviously wasn't going anywhere. So he was seen as free labor, fixing the plumbing, doing electrical work, and made trustee of the cell block.
Pee Wee ran a pawn shops of sorts. He'd loan money to other inmates, he sold dope, arranged sexual encounters, and was in charge of the jobs, controlling which inmate got to work in the library and which ones worked the laundry or the kitchen or mopped the floors. He was so trusted, he had his own elaborate set of tools which he'd lug about, the prison handyman, fixing whatever needed to be fixed in the decrepit 120-year-old prison.
After accepting the hit job for Rudolph Tyner, the first thing Pee Wee did was befriend the man and gain his trust. By chance, Pee Wee's cell backed up to death row, and Pee Wee was able to shout through the vents and communicate with Tyner and talk to him. Pee Wee, like many psychopaths, was a master manipulator and could be incredibly charming. He knew how to get what he wanted out of people. Soon, Rudolph thought he'd made a true friend and confidant. Not realizing that Pee Wee Gaskins was a staunch racist, dead set on murdering him the first chance he got.
Pee Wee would often come on the death row on various errands and was always sure to visit Rudolph, delivering clean sheets, fixing the plumbing, slipping him little gifts to cement their friendship, seeking out how he was going to kill him. It would be a difficult quest to kill a man on death row, something that had never been done before, but Pee Wee Gaskins felt up for the job.
First, Pee Wee tried to poison Rudolph. Tony Simo had mailed him toxic oleander leaves that had been boiled down into poison. Simo had tried the poison on a dog, and it had worked, killing the poor creature, and Simo assured Pee Wee the poison would do the job.
Pee Wee was able to sprinkle the concentrate on Rudolph's food, but in the end, it only made him sick. So he made a powder of the stuff and slipped it to Tyner, who'd been a heroin addict on the outside, telling him that it was drugs. Tyner ingested the stuff and was made so ill he had to be brought to the infirmary near death, but he pulled through. And when he saw Pee Wee again, he told him that that dope he'd given him had been so powerful, so good that he'd overdosed and nearly died, not suspecting at all that he'd actually been poisoned.
Wow, that's Jesus. Yeah, which really goes to show what a master manipulator Pee Wee Gaskins was. He's delivering poisoned food to this man, slipping him what he says are drugs and are not. Yet Rudolph still trusts him, considers him a friend. It's scary. Pee Wee could make anyone believe what he wanted them to, almost like a magician creating deadly illusions.
Pee Wee was growing frustrated, so he called Tony Simo on the phone, angry that the poison hadn't worked. And for some bizarre reason, he recorded this call himself. You can actually find it on YouTube and listen to it. He told him, "I need one electric cap and as much a stick of dynamite as you can get. I'll take a damn radio, rig it up with a bomb. When he plungs that son of a bitch in, it'll go off, and there won't be no coming back from that."
Both Pee Wee's and Rudolph Tyner's cells were on the ground floor of the prison block, which was made up of 15 cells on each side of an island that rose up out of the middle, death row being on the far side. While the prison itself had been built in 1867, this cell block had been built in the 30s, and was basically the stereotypical prison you see in movies, just like Shawshank.
So in between Pee Wee's cell and Tyner's was a thin area they called the trace. It was a small space where electrical wires and plumbing went. And Pee Wee, as the trustee, had access to the trace and was able to run a wire out of his cell through the back vent into the trace and then into Rudolph Tyner's vent. Pee Wee told Tyner he was going to rig up a little phone they could use to talk to each other, kind of like tin cans connected by a string.
Pee Wee took a metal cup, packed the bottom with C4 explosives, then filled it with shrapnel, nails, nuts, bolts, shards of metal, and over this he glued a radio speaker. Then had a friend named James Brown, no, not the singer, deliver the speaker to Tyner.
Pee Wee then yelled through his vent into Tyner's cell, "Hook that wire up to the speaker and put it to your ear. Then tell me if you can hear me through it."
Rudolph followed the instructions, doing as he was told, connecting the wire, putting the speaker to his ear, and shouting through the vent,
"Okay, boss, all set."
Pee Wee Gaskins then plugged the cord into an electrical socket, the power streaming through the cord, igniting the explosives, blowing off Tyner's hand, and embedding the speaker into his brain with a good amount of shrapnel as well, killing him instantly.
Pee Wee then pulled the length of wire back into his cell, quickly cut it into small sections, and flushed them all down the toilet. He then went out into the hall and shouted, "Well, what the hell was that?"
At first, it was believed that Rudolph had tried to escape by blowing a hole in the wall, but the shrapnel and how the device had been embedded in his head quickly ruled that out. The FBI was brought in, as well as SLED investigators. They wondered if it was a suicide, but soon there were whispers going about. As Pee Wee would say, folks was jawing and snitching.
Pee Wee's cell was searched. In it, they found all kinds of crazy shit. All kinds of tools that could have been used, as well as nuts and bolts that matched the shrapnel found embedded in Rudolph's brain. They also found marijuana and 38 audio tapes.
Many of the tapes had television and radio shows recorded on them, but some were phone conversations, hours of them. Pee Wee recorded all his phone conversations, wanted them documented for some reason, even those where he discussed murder. And though he often used an alias when talking, there was no denying his incredibly distinctive, high-pitched voice as he talked with Tony Sima, planning the murder of Rudolph Tyner. Pee Wee Gaskins was cold busted.
They had him. There was no denying he was the one behind it. It all came out. The murder for hire, the $200 paid for the hit, all the failed poisonings. but there is still the mystery of just how he pulled it off, how he got the explosives, and in particular, how did he get 50 feet of wire?
And the answer to how he got that 50 feet of wire is the one that will reveal much of the true nature of Pee Wee Gaskins, for it was unknowingly supplied by the man who was paid to write his biography.
Chapter 1, Mr. Jim. James Beatty was born April 20th, 1936, in Charlotte, North Carolina. His father was an acclaimed reverend, and James studied to be a reverend as well, attending Columbia Bible College, but he instead found a deep love of literature and went on to get his PhD in English literature from the University of South Carolina, eventually becoming an English professor at Coastal Carolina University.
James fell in love with a beautiful redhead named Anita, who also had a dear love of literature and had a master's degree in English. They married, had 6 children, and lived in Myrtle Beach, just 1 block from the ocean. They were the portrait of a peaceful, happy life, a happiness and tranquility that would be shattered by convicted mass murderer Pee Wee Gaskins.
In 1981, an old college buddy named Grady Query called Jim up out of the blue. Grady had gone on to become an attorney and was now living in Charleston. He told Jim he'd like to hire him to write the biography of his client, an infamous criminal named Pee Wee Gaskins, who'd spent over half his life in prison and been convicted of rape, assault, auto theft, and murder. Many murders. So many that he had his own graveyard. In fact, he'd actually set the record for the most murders in the state of South Carolina.
James Beatty felt conflicted and told his friend he would think about it and call him back. He did not like sensationalist writing. He wasn't a fan of horror, didn't like gratuitous prose full of blood and guts and gore, and he really had no interest in true crime either. He studied and taught the classics, Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Charles Dickens.
But I just have to say real quick that Shakespeare is truly filled with blood and guts and gore, ghosts and witches as well. But I digress.
But it is classy blood and guts and gore.
I suppose the way we look at it these days, back then they knew what they were getting.
I know, I'm totally fucking with you. It's totally blood and guts and gore.
But while he didn't particularly have an affection for true crime, James Beatty did, however, love the book In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Now, true crime has been around forever. Even the Bible can be seen as true crime. Right in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, we are told of the murder of Abel by his brother Cain. And the Romans wrote books on true crime. The English had their penny dreadfuls telling about Jack the Ripper. And in America, tales of crime on the Western frontier were incredibly popular. But Truman Capote's In Cold Blood is often seen as the first example of true crime being offered as literature, as art, whereas before it had either been seen as news or just cheap exploitation.
James thought if criminals were studied like they were in Cold Blood and understood, perhaps our psychological understanding of them could help to curtail their formation. Jim saw the inherent value in true crime as a means of understanding crime from a sociological and psychological perspective, and instinctively realized the benefits of literary true crime as a deterrent and warning.
So he held a family meeting, gathering his wife and children around the kitchen table to discuss the project and whether or not he should agree to it.
The younger children, Christian and Elizabeth, thought it sounded fun and exciting. But his older children, Mark and Jim Jr., who'd grown up hearing about Gaskins in the newspapers, were worried and quite scared. He was an infamous murderer, after all.
But Anita saw the benefits of studying the criminal aspect of society, of trying to understand and empathize with it as a means of stopping it. They were good Christians, after all. And didn't Jesus minister to criminals and forgive all trespasses? Wasn't the penitent thief crucified there by Jesus the first to reap the benefits of redemption? And so it was agreed, as a family, that James Beattie would write the biography of Pee Wee Gaskins.
Chapter 2. Pee Wee. James Beattie called his lawyer friend back and told him he was in, telling him to send him all the notes, references, and court documents on Pee Wee Gaskins that he would need, and he would write the book.
But Grady laughed and told him he'd have to ask Pee Wee himself for those documents.
James was stunned. What did he mean, ask Pee Wee himself?
Well, Grady said, you have to go meet him. He wants to meet you. He won't agree to have his story told until he gets to know you.
This put a new twist to the assignment, going to the prison. Anita was worried. Visiting a murderer in prison seemed dangerous, but James told her there was nothing to worry about and headed to Columbia's Central Correctional Institution, or the CCI.
The CCI was originally named South Carolina Penitentiary and had been built way back in 1866, right after the Civil War, because the county jails had been ravished in fighting. Also, very disturbingly, the institution was used as a means of prolonging slavery, which was completely legal. For while the 13th Amendment to the United States outlawed slavery, it makes an exception when it is used as punishment for a crime. And this is actually a very disturbing and dark element of the United States.
So the prison had been packed with African Americans, many arrested under bogus charges, and during the 1870s, prisoners would be leased out for slave labor, working in phosphate mines and building railroads. Nearly half of those leased out to labor building railroad tracks would be worked to death.
Because of negative press coverage and public outcry, in the 1880s, the prison stopped leasing out slave labor and instead began concentrating the use of forced labor within the penitentiary itself. In 1883, the Columbia Hosiery Company established a hosiery mill in the prison, with convicts producing stockings and other knitted goods. And in 1917, the hosiery mill was converted to a furniture factory. And in 1922, the harsh living conditions in slave labor actually led to riots.
As Jim Beattie drove toward the prison and through the barbed wire fences for his appointment with Pee Wee, he was suddenly flooded with memories. He'd been here before, as a child. His grandfather had actually been the warden of the prison, and Jim used to visit him. That is, until the day some prisoners broke into the warden's office and killed a captain. Jim's grandfather was unharmed, though being the actual target. He wasn't even in the building at the time. But the prison was deemed too dangerous for a child, and the visits stopped.
James entered the prison through the same gates he'd passed as a child, visiting his grandpappy 35 years earlier. The metal doors clanging shut, the echoes filling him with revelry, and was brought to a room where Pee Wee Gaskins stood, smiling, reaching out for a handshake.
Pee Wee was a short man, 5'3", and wore no handcuffs. In fact, Jim would never see him once in handcuffs. Jim was struck by both how tiny his hands were, saying they were the smallest hands he'd ever seen on a grown man, and conversely by how powerful his grip was. He had coal black hair, piercing black eyes, and an incredibly distinctive voice, high-pitched with a country twang and southern drawl. And he always said everything twice.
Nice to meet you, nice to meet you.
Jim found Pee Wee to be graceful, cordial, and gracious. Pee Wee addressed him as Mr. Jim, both formal and endearing, and showing both respect and familiarity. There was only one time in the relationship when Pee Wee wouldn't use the moniker Mr. Jim, a moment that terrified James Beatty to the core.
The meeting was a short one, just a preliminary introduction. But now that they'd met and Pee Wee had approved of him, Jim was told he was free to visit Pee Wee at the prison any day he wanted, between 8 and 5. He didn't even have to make an appointment. Just come on in and ask for Pee Wee, which was surprising. Pee Wee seemed to have a lot of pull, like he was running the show in many ways, and he was obviously given a lot of respect.
So Jim started meeting with him regularly. Pee Wee told him about his incredibly violent childhood, how he was beaten mercilessly by his uncles and stepbrothers, how he didn't know who his father was as a child, didn't even know his real name, Donald, until he heard it read in court when he was 13. Pee Wee told him how, when he was just a baby, he drank a bottle of kerosene that caused him to have convulsions for years. Then Pee Wee grew very serious, leaning in and locking eyes with Jim Beatty.
Look, I want to set the record straight on a few things. First off, I went to reform school on a false charge. False charge. I found that girl lying there bloody in a field. Bloody in a field. I was trying to help her. Help her. They said I hit her in the head with an axe, but I didn't do that. No, I didn't do nothing like that. I was innocent. Innocent. And put in reform school at 13. Just 13 and given 5 years for a crime I didn't commit. And I've never raped anyone. Never. Never had to. I'm not much of a looker, but I got my share. And I ain't ever killed nobody that didn't need killing. They broke the code. Broke the code. It was just business. Business.
Jim would later say about that moment, quote, "He was so utterly fetching. You listen to him and you're mesmerized. He's magnetic. He's somewhat articulate, though uneducated, and couldn't string 2 sentences together grammatically to save his life. But you are drawn to what he's saying. He's convincing, and my mind and spirit began to believe him."
And Jim was struck by the great parallels of their lives. They were more or less the same age. Pee Wee just a year older than Jim. They'd grown up in the same area, a mere 80 miles away from each other. They'd even worked in the same place, the Campbell's Soup Factory. And they'd laugh over that, how despite the name, the factory didn't even make Campbell's soup, but made Swanson's chicken pot pies. And they'd both worked there, butchering chickens.
Jim wondered how they could have ended up so differently. Both born in the same time period, in the same state, even working the same job. But one ended up a professor of English literature, and the other ended up a convicted mass murderer who'd led a life of crime. Jim was happily married to the same woman, Anita, his life partner, best friend, and intellectual equal. And Pee Wee had been married 6 times, and considered all his wives below him, little more than servants.
But while Pee Wee had grown up neglected and beaten, not knowing who his father was, Jim had grown up in a loving home. His father, a Presbyterian minister. Jim had never received a single spanking growing up. He was loved, adored, and cared for. Jim had loved going to church and hearing his father's sermons, and Pee Wee had hated church, had felt judged and despised, looked down on, and even hated.
Jim came to believe that Pee Wee had been taught to hate. He became determined to discover how a monster is created. And to do that, he believed he had to find that kernel of original goodness in Pee Wee, that flicker of light that had not been corrupted by the evil of the world. Jim was determined to write a book of redemption and hope, a book that could help the world to understand how a killer is created, and hopefully help stop future killers from being made. If he could stop just one child from becoming another Pee Wee Gaskins through the redemption of this killer, he felt he would have achieved his goal.
Jim found Pee Wee to be a complex person that showed both anger and compassion at almost the same moment. Eventually, Jim gave Pee Wee his home phone number, and every Sunday, Pee Wee would call their house, often talking to one of the children, usually little Christian, asking him, "Are you going to Sunday school? Are you listening to your mama and daddy? Good, good. You be a good boy now."
Pee Wee became a part of their family, like some weird distant uncle. One day, Christian came running up to Jim, shouting, "Daddy, Daddy, the state of South Carolina is mistreating Pee Wee. They're neglecting his medical needs, and he's suing them for $1 million."
Jim was dumbstruck. "Son, what on earth are you talking about?"
Pee Wee called, Daddy. He's got untreated hemorrhoids, and he's suing the state for neglect. We're all invited to the hearing.
Jim called Pee Wee's lawyer, who confirmed it all. Yes, Pee Wee Gaskins was suing the state of South Carolina for $1 million for neglecting his hemorrhoids, and the entire family was indeed invited to the hearing.
And so the entire Beatty family went to the hearing. Jim, Anita, and all 5 of their children.
Pee Wee made his case, describing how the state had ignored his medical needs. The district attorney, he just completely ignored him. He didn't even offer a rebuttal. And the judge said he'd announce his decision at a later date.
Afterwards, little Christian approached Pee Wee as he was being led away, politely introducing himself, and the two shook hands.
And it was Christian who got the call a few days later. Pee Wee had won the case. He'd successfully sued the state of South Carolina for neglecting his hemorrhoids. Woo! Only the judge didn't award him $1 million. Instead, the settlement was for $1 and a large tube of Preparation H. Still, he'd won.
Oh my God. Oh, geez. A few days later, there was a package in the mail addressed to Christian from Pee Wee Gaskins. The family gathered around the box, wondering what could this man, often called the redneck Charles Manson by the press, have sent their young son from prison.
They opened the box to find a homemade hat Pee Wee had made the boy. On the top was a golden crown, and from either side sprouted devil horns, which had been painted with bright red enamel paint.
It was bizarre, a satanic-looking thing, and it terrified most of the family. But Christian loved it, thought it was awesome, and happily wore it about.
It makes me think of Max and Where the Wild Things Are.
Yes, totally. Oh my God. And while Pee Wee Gaskins was making inroads with the family of James Beatty, so too was James making inroads with Pee Wee's family.
Jim started talking to Pee Wee's mother, Eula, who explained she'd had Pee Wee at 14, and she was just a child, and it was the height of the Great Depression. But since then, she'd become a respectable church-going woman who'd atoned for her past sins.
Jim was surprised to hear that though she'd lived in the state of South Carolina her entire life, she'd never once been to the beach. So Jim took her to the shore for a picnic, showing her the ocean for the very first time.
Jim found Pee Wee's mother to be a very proper and demure woman, a devout believer in Christ. Though she lived in a tiny shack of a home, she kept it immaculately neat. The rough-hewn pine floor scrubbed so clean you could eat off it. And he became friends with Pee Wee's sister as well, taking her out to lunch, gathering details about their hectic and hellish childhood. It seemed Pee Wee's family had been able to rise up out of the crushing poverty of the Depression into respectable, law-abiding citizens. And it was only Pee Wee who'd fell into this life of crime.
But despite how friendly their families were becoming, Pee Wee wasn't afraid to show his true nature at times. During one visit, Jim noticed that Pee Wee had grown his thumbnails out into long points. He asked him, "Pee Wee, why are your thumbnails so long?"
Well, let me show you, Mr. Jim. Let me show you.
Pee Wee Gaskins then placed his hands on either side of Jim's face, putting his thumbs on the bridge of his nose right beside his eyes, explaining how there were two guards that had it in for him, and that if they ever gave him any trouble, he was going to gouge their eyes out, demonstrating how he could sink his thumbnails right into the eye sockets.
Later, when Jim would tell this story to friends, they'd all exclaim and ask why he'd allowed the infamous and terrifying Pee Wee Gaskins to put his hands on his face and demonstrate how he could rip the eyes from a person's skull with his thumbs. And Jim replied,
Well, you don't let Pee Wee do anything. Pee Wee does what he wants.
Chapter 3, Pee Wee and Me.
Jim was determined to tell Pee Wee's story with compassion and honesty, and to offer redemption to the killer. Redemption through Christ, who was all-forgiving. He decided to call his book of spiritual redemption, Pee Wee and Me.
Pee Wee started by telling the story of his mother, Eula Parrott, who'd been forced to quit school at 12 to pick cotton in the field at the height of the Great Depression, at a time when 12,000 workers a day were losing their jobs. And by 14, Eula had been forced to turn to sex work, becoming the paid mistress of a wealthy man named simply Mr. Gaskins, and soon became pregnant.
Pee Wee was born Donald Henry Parrott Jr. and was only 4 pounds at birth, a tiny thing, earning him the nickname Pee Wee, which he'd keep the rest of his life. Growing up, he believed his real name was simply Parrott Jr. and wouldn't realize he was actually named Donald until he was sent to reform school, eventually changing his last name to Gaskins when he realized who his true father actually was.
Pee Wee described a childhood of utter neglect, beaten both at home and school, forced to raise himself on his own, finding work as a mechanic at a very young age, a trade he was naturally gifted at and would continue for the rest of his life, eventually incorporating his love of automobiles into a life of crime.
Pee Wee told Mr. Jim how he'd been falsely accused of heinous crimes his entire life, that he'd run with a tough crowd, and they'd been singled out and set up, accused of raping a young girl, and then, after being falsely accused of attempted murder, of bludgeoning a girl with an axe during a failed robbery attempt, a crime he swore he didn't commit. He'd been sent to the hell of reform school called South Carolina Industrial School for White Boys.
Yes, you heard that right. For white boys. The reform school was openly segregated and racist. And Jim, who had abhorred racism, began to see that Pee Wee had been taught to be racist. It was something he'd learned, taken to heart, and many of his murders would be caused by this racist code he lived by.
In the South Carolina Industrial School for White Boys, Pee Wee was abused and sexually assaulted, learning that might makes right and to fight. Again, Mr. Jim was struck by how he learned a way of violence, that he'd been taught this. The reform school was so hellish and horrible that Pee Wee fled, escaping the horrible place, and on the outside, newly freed, he joined a traveling carnival called Amusement of America.
The life of a carny appealed to Pee Wee on many levels. The travel and excitement, as well as the many scams that presented themselves. During this time, he married his first wife, a 13-year-old girl named Mary. But because he loved her so much and thought a life on the run was too much for his dear wife to handle, he returned to the reform school to serve out the short remainder of his sentence. But that siren's call of the carnival would always remain, and he was a carny in his heart.
When Pee Wee turned 18 on March 13, 1951, he was released from the South Carolina Industrial School for White Boys. He moved in with his wife Mary's family in Georgetown, South Carolina, and they had a daughter named Shirley.
Pee Wee worked a series of odd jobs, including on tobacco farms, where he found lucrative work as an arsonist. Tobacco farmers would hire him to burn down one of their barns, which were fully insured for much more than their actual value. And they'd tell the insurance company the barn had been full of tobacco, when in reality the crop had already been sold and the barn was empty. So they'd be paid by the insurance company not only for a brand new barn, but for the crop of tobacco as well.
But his barn-burning ways soon caught up to him, and he was sent to South Carolina State Penitentiary for the first time. And it was here that he'd commit his first murder, slitting the throat of one Hazel Brazel, who was said to be the toughest man in the prison. Pee Wee told Jim he'd really had no choice, that it was part self-defense and part setting himself up as what he called being a power man. Once you'd achieved power man status, the other inmates would no longer beat and rape you. You'd rise up through the ranks to an elevated status.
Pee Wee was able to convince prison officials the murder had been committed as self-defense and only received a few months of solitary for punishment. And Pee Wee was now a power man, but was devastated to hear that back home, Mary was seeking a divorce. So, determined to find his wife and stop the divorce, he escaped from prison by hiding in a trash barrel. And on the outside, unable to find his wife, he hooked back up with the traveling carnival circuit.
Traveling with the carnival was an excellent way of living a life on the run, as no one asked questions and he was never in one place for too long. But after some crazy adventures with a beautiful woman from the carnival's girly show of exotic dancers that included unwillingly aiding a prison break, he was picked up by the FBI and had the charge of crossing state lines added to his other offenses. And he was sent to a federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia, where he was befriended by Frank Costello, the godfather of the Genovese crime family in New York, and learned the ways of the mafia, telling Jim that they taught him that killing was just business, just something a man had to do from time to time.
Pee Wee stressed to Jim that he wasn't some psychopathic, crazed lunatic sex killer. He was just following a code when he killed. Pee Wee explained he lived by a strict code. For example, you could not curse or drink alcohol in front of children. And Jim had in fact noticed that Pee Wee never cursed in front of him. He could be crude, but he never cursed. It was part of his code, a code that unfortunately involved racism. But that was just the way of the world to Pee Wee, and the code had to be followed.
Like with Martha Ann Dix, a Black woman with whom Pee Wee was friendly. She was a wild character, a lesbian who liked to dress as a man and went by the name Clyde. Pee Wee explained that he actually liked her, enjoyed her company, but when she started telling people that she'd slept with Pee Wee and was pregnant with his child, he had to kill her. It was just part of his code. A Black woman couldn't be spreading lies about a white man. And the mixing of the races was absolutely abhorrent as well. Even to joke about such things was an offense. Pee Wee explained that he didn't hate Black people, they just needed to know their place. He left her body in a ditch as he didn't think she was worthy of being buried.
And if a white person crossed this line, went against his code of ethics, Pee Wee felt he had no choice but to end their life as well. As he'd often say, lots of people just don't deserve to live.
Like Doreen Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter Robin. Doreen had been the girlfriend of Pee Wee's good friend Johnny Sellers and had been living with Pee Wee, but had committed the unforgivable offense of getting pregnant by a Black man. So Pee Wee drowned her, her unborn child, and her 2-year-old daughter in his pond. It just had to be done.
And as for his friend Johnny Sellers, well, he had been jawing about their stealing dealings. And by this point, Pee Wee had a huge car theft ring going. And when he caught wind that Johnny was talking about it, he shot him in the back of the head. And he couldn't let his girlfriend go after that. She'd be jawing as well. So he stabbed her to death. It was just business, nothing personal.
Pee Wee told Jim he'd learned from his mafia connections that murder was a good-paying job and had no problems with being an assassin. Like when he was hired to kill Silas Yates by his ex-girlfriend. Just business.
Or when he killed half-brothers Dennis Bellamy and John Henry Knight. They'd been jawing about his stealing dealings, and they had to go. John Henry Knight was only 15 years old, and Pee Wee says he truly, truly liked him. Pee Wee never showed any remorse, but he would often say, "It's a shame Johnny Knight had to die. Just a real shame."
And Jim saw that Pee Wee Gaskins wasn't a madman, a lunatic. He'd just been taught this code, this ethic of hate and racism and murder for hire. And Jim felt that Pee Wee could be redeemed. And this would be the theme of the book he was writing, Pee Wee and Me, a tale of redemption and hope. One day, curious, Jim asked Pee Wee, "Would you ever lie to me?"
Yes, I would.
"I'm surprised, Pee Wee. When would you lie to me?"
About half the time. Gaskins then told Jim what a great liar he was and how he could pass any lie detector test and had done so numerous times simply by concentrating on wiggling his right pinky toe.
Crystal Lake Entertainment presents the Shadows and Ink podcast, where the lines between reality and fiction blur and the pen drips red. Dive deep into the horror genre as host A.F. Stewart grills today's horror authors, sharing juicy tidbits about their books. Go behind the shadowy curtain as the insider secrets spill with publishers, narrators, and industry professionals. Fall into the abyss with lively debates and discussions that rip open the horror tropes and sift through their guts. Come with us past the crossroads, stroll through the cemeteries, and howl under the full moon. Shadows and Ink, come join us. We are not afraid of what lurks in the dark. This monthly podcast is available through most major podcast platforms.
Chapter 4. The Other Side of Pee Wee Gaskins.
Pee Wee mentioned a crime to Jim that had been committed by a fellow on death row, a black man named Rudolph Tyner, who'd murdered a store owner and his wife, who were white, asking Jim if he was familiar with that case.
Jim replied, "Oh yeah, as a matter of fact, he had known Myrtle and Bill, shopped in their little store on occasion." Pee Wee suddenly grew excited, asking,
"You really knew them?
Jim told him yes. They weren't close friends or anything, but he knew them. Pee Wee nodded and seemed to reflect on this. And another time, when they were talking as prisoners were strolling about, Pee Wee excitedly pointed out one to Mr. Jim, saying,
Look, Mr. Jim, there he is, Rudolph Tyner. That's the man that killed your friends. If I had my 38, I could blow his head off right now. Blow his head right off." One day, while Jim was in the prison interviewing Pee Wee asked a favor of him. He explained his son's birthday was coming up and asked him to bring a radio to his mother so she could give it to his son for his birthday, saying, "I'd be mighty grateful, Mr. Jim, mighty grateful."
Jim told him it would be no trouble, as he often visited Pee Wee's mother. But it was a hectic week for Jim, and unexpected events kept him from bringing Eula the radio, though he planned on doing it at any moment.
Then there was a phone call. Christian answered and went to Jim, saying it was Pee Wee on the phone, but he sounded different, that he wasn't friendly and didn't want to talk to him like he usually did.
Jim got on the phone. "Hello?"
"Is this Mr. Beatty?"
A sliver of ice ran down Jim's spine. This was the only time Pee Wee had ever addressed him as Mr. Beatty. No longer was there that familiarity, that casual friendliness of a first-name relationship. Jim stuttered slightly. "Well, yes, of course it's me. How are you, Pee Wee?"
Did I have occasion to give you a radio last weekend to take to my mother, to give to my son for his birthday,
"You certainly did, and please let me apologize. I am very sorry."
When do you think you'll be able to do that?
"This afternoon."
Can I tell my mother it will be there today?
"Yes."
The phone went dead.
After that, Jim noticed a coldness in Pee Wee Gaskins. He still smiled and shook his hand, called him Mr. Jim again, but Jim had broken the code. He'd unknowingly crossed Pee Wee Gaskins, the meanest man in America.
During one visit, Jim looked about to discover there were no guards present, that they were completely alone, no other inmates, and it was quiet, too quiet. Jim realized he was locked in with Pee Wee, that he had no way of getting out, and Pee Wee was grinning at him with black, cold eyes. Jim tried to act nonchalant, to hide his nervousness, but he couldn't help but to be shaky. Couldn't help to wonder how he'd even gotten himself in this situation, sitting in a maximum security prison with a convicted multiple murderer, locked in a room with the man who killed more people in the state of South Carolina than any other.
After what felt like hours, finally a guard arrived and let Jim out, and Pee Wee looked at him and said,
"Don't worry, Mr. Jim. You were perfectly safe. I was here with you, and I wouldn't let anything happen to you."
Now Jim felt like he had to prove himself to Pee Wee, show his loyalty and his sincere friendship. So when Pee Wee asked for another favor, Jim felt he had little choice but to oblige.
So back in the 70s, before cable TV and satellite dishes became prominent, everyone got their television signal from an antenna. Lots of TVs had little antennas on them, but if you were really hip, you'd have this big, ugly thing installed on your roof that gave you much better reception and allowed you to tune in to stations from neighboring towns and watch their local sports.
Pee Wee explained to Jim how the prison had one of those antennas, and if you were connected to it, you could watch Sunday football. But sadly, only a couple of televisions had access to it. He told Jim he had an idea. If he could get some cable, he'd be able to hook every television on his cell block to the antenna, and all the boys could watch football on Sundays.
Jim himself loved watching football on Sundays, which Pee Wee obviously knew, and being a psychopathic master manipulator, exploited to his advantage. So he asked Jim if he'd mail him 50 feet of flat cable.
Jim asked, "Am I allowed to do such a thing?"
And Pee Wee explained, "Oh yeah, people mail stuff like that all the time." Besides, he was a trustee in charge of the electrical, the plumbing. He had all kinds of tools and privileges. He wasn't your average inmate.
So Jim went to the local Ace Hardware and bought a 50-foot roll of flat cable wire, the kind used to attach antennas to televisions, and mailed it to Pee Wee in prison, using his own home as the return address, really thinking nothing of it, just happy that the prisoners would get to watch football on Sundays. Jim loved Sunday football. It was only fair they'd get to watch it too.
Little did James Beatty know, but he'd just become an accomplice to murder, as it was this wire that Pee Wee Gaskins would use to detonate the C4 explosive that had been smuggled to him inside Tony Simo's shoe and blow shrapnel into the brain of Rudolph Tyner.
Chapter 5. Post-Explosion. After the explosion, the press went crazy. A man apparently murdered on death row. It was an absolute first. Never had someone on death row been murdered before. And the news hit James Beatty and his family like a load of bricks. Jim knew very well that Pee Wee had wanted Tyner dead. Pee Wee had once said it right to his face, and a bomb like that would need something to detonate it. Something like 50 feet of cable wire.
When it was finally confirmed that Pee Wee was behind the murder, the press now dubbing him the meanest man in America, Jim and Anita did not know what to do. Should they go to the police? Explain that Jim was an unwitting accomplice? That he'd sent the wire but honestly had no idea what it was really going to be used for? They struggled for an answer and decided to pray over it.
They prayed and prayed and prayed and never did go to the police. One day Jim was giving a lecture on Shakespeare at the college when he noticed a number of men in the back of the lecture hall in black suits, arms crossed, eyeing him suspiciously. After the class, they approached him, told him they were with the FBI, and wanted to have a talk with him.
He took the men into his office. They asked him if he had sent a cable to Donald Pee Wee Gaskins in prison. And Jim confirmed, yes, he had.
They asked him, "Did you know it was used for a murder?"
Jim told them that he did not know that, which, kind of funny that a self-proclaimed man of God can lie when it suits his purposes. But, the poor guy was truly shook to his core.
After eyeing him, the agents told him he was going to be subpoenaed for the upcoming trial. Jim asked, "Subpoenaed for the defense or the prosecution?"
They told him they didn't know and left.
Jim sat there in his little office with a heavy heart, his soul aching. Would he now be seen as an accomplice to murder? He could lose his job, his tenure, everything he'd worked so hard for. His reputation as a man of God, a good Christian, an upstanding member of society. It could all be gone or tarnished beyond recognition.
And all hope for Pee Wee's redemption was gone as well as hope for the book. He gave up on the possibility of Pee Wee having a kernel of goodness in his heart, of being capable of redemption. And he gave up on his own hopes of ever being a writer as well. He was no writer. He couldn't see people's inner nature. It had all been a lie, and he was a fool. He was no more a friend to Pee Wee Gaskins than any of his victims had been. He was just a tool in the hands of a psychopathic killer. And he thought back to words he'd once heard a preacher say to him while researching this case. "Son, some of God's creatures ain't worth a damn."
For the second time in his life, James Beatty was banned from entering the South Carolina prison. He waited for his subpoena, wondering what Pee Wee would say about his role in the murder, wondering what was to become of the life he'd worked so hard for.
But the subpoena never came. Pee Wee went to court for the murder and never implicated Mr. Jim, never mentioned the wire that had been mailed to him. And it was one wild trial. Pee Wee tried to blame the murder on James Brown, the man he'd given the speaker to deliver to Rudolph Tyner.
When James Brown was put on the stand, the prosecution asked what his relationship was with Pee Wee, and he shocked the courtroom by proclaiming, "He was my lover."
As everyone gasped, Pee Wee sent everything into chaos by leaping up and, far from denying it, shouted, "Tell them who was on top! Tell them who was on top!"
Oh my God. In the end, Pee Wee was found guilty and given the death penalty, and he wouldn't be able to worm his way out of it like he'd done the last time he'd narrowly avoided the electric chair.
Jim and Anita were so traumatized by the whole thing that they moved away. Jim leaving the state where he'd been born and raised. They settled down in Atlanta, Georgia. Anita got a job at Georgia State, and Jim started teaching English at Vasilla Heights Bible College. He would never speak to Pee Wee Gaskins again.
Pee Wee, meanwhile, found another writer to take up his cause, a journalist named Wilton Earl, and together they began writing an autobiography entitled The Final Truth. Only this version of events would be much different than that he gave to Mr. Jim.
Yes, The Final Truth is much, much different version of Pee Wee's life than the story he told Mr. Jim. Like many psychopaths, Pee Wee told people what they wanted to hear as a means of manipulating them, seeing people as nothing more than a tool to use for his benefit. James Beattie, he wanted a story of redemption, the tale of a good man born into an evil world that had been taught to hate, taught to kill, a man who could be saved. But what Wilton Earl wanted was something juicy, something tantalizing, something that would shock the world. And shock the world they would. As Pee Wee Gaskins said, "They want something juicy? I'll give them something juicy."
And if you want to hear this version of events, you're going to have to tune in next week for part 2 of our look at Pee Wee Gaskins, The Final Truth.
And a bit of a warning, The Final Truth is one of the most disturbing, shocking, and utterly gross books ever written. I mean, it's really, really fucked up. A lot of it's considered fabricated by Pee Wee, who was exploiting the public's fascination with serial killers. But we're going to go through it all for you and glean what truth we can from it.
And for now, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Yep, thanks for listening, guys. We will see you next week for part 2. And we want to hear from you. You got a case you think we should cover? Did we get something wrong? You want to say, hey, drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Bye.